Hello everyone, I'm Ismail Civico and welcome to Youth on Air podcast. So in this episode we're going to speak a bit about the freedom of movement in the EU and how COVID-19 essentially has actually affected this freedom of movement that we've so much taken for granted for the past years, let's say, or decades in a way. With us today we have Maxime van der Kerkhove with us. And firstly I would like, Maxime, please just present yourself a little bit. Who is Maxime in a nutshell?
Well, I'm a 27-year-old from Bruges. I have quite a long background in politics and economics, but I've always been a very pro-European, pan-European person. And for me, my identity will always be European with a specific regional background. But for me, it's very important that we keep on defending this common European identity that we all share.
Thank you. I mean, that is a very interesting topic indeed, because usually when you ask young people, they don't essentially or generally say that they are firstly European and then they are from that country. They usually say, I am this and then I'm European. So it's not always, you don't get to hear that so often. So how come you have this kind of more European perspective on things and not so much Belgian perspective? Because of course you are from Bruges in that regard. What's the background in that a bit?
Well, I always had the privilege to grow up in a family who was always keen on going on adventures, keen on traveling in Europe. And whenever I went out of Europe and I re-entered Europe, no matter which country it was, I always feel like at home. And for me, my family has always been everywhere in Europe. And I never felt like I was abroad. We shared this common identity. We had these open borders because when I was very young, I still remember going with my grandparents just across the border with the Netherlands. Now you have still border controls. You have still the customs. You still have to declare your goods. But when I was like 6 years old, all of a sudden this went away. And I really felt even back then a sense of freedom, a sense of relief that for me all these regions were all of a sudden interconnected. And I had the opportunity since I was young to have many friends across borders, and then all of a sudden it was easy to go and visit them, and this had been of a very high value to me.
Again, I like the fact that you brought up the privilege that we had indeed, or a lot of people in the EU specifically, we've had the privilege, not most of them I would say, but a small minority within the EU that has had the privilege to even travel within the EU. So not even talking about outside EU people generally. So I do like that perspective that you bring in. Now, let's get a bit into the conversation because I'm under the impression it's going to be very, very interesting given the fact that you have that specific insight. What do you think that the main problems caused by COVID, let's say, in terms of the lives of young people in Europe in general, aside right now from the health aspect of COVID in that regard?
Well, let's start with a very interesting aspect of time. I see a lot of people whose lives are only playing in a very small geographical area. They're saying that, oh, but COVID is only 1 or 2 years in a lifetime. What does it matter? It's just a short period of time you need to go through. But for young people who still need to build their network, who still need to discover what their talents are, for them 2 years is a very, very long time. And to come to the point of borders, for my personal development, these cross-cultural, cross-border projects and connections have been of a very high value, even more than all my studies combined. And if you see that people now, the young people, these opportunities are taken away from them, this will have a very big impact in the future because we will be the young generation who will be able to make agreements, whatever we might do, in politics, in business, or any other sector. We will be the first generation who will be able to make agreements in a very broad understanding of the cultural differences we all have. And now that these 2 years are taken away from a very specific age group, certainly the people who are going from high school to university, these are the highest infected by this, I guess we're taking away a lot of our future for that, because we really need this intercultural dialogue with a full understanding of the differences, the political, economic, but also religious differences that we have. And what hurts me the most in this crisis is that these soft skills are not valued enough in society. I see it here from a personal level in Belgium. The only thing you can do now as a young person is study in a formal way, and then you're a good student, then you're good, then you're successful, certainly in this corona crisis. But whenever you want to develop your soft skills, whenever you want to learn from other cultures, this is not possible now. You're not allowed to do that. You're actually bad. You can only be good as youth right now if your life plays along in a small village, and that hurts me because I guess you as well. We had the opportunity to learn so many things, and this is just taken away.
It's very interesting everything you said. I do have 2 points to take out from that. Firstly is the point you made from the perception of time that young people have, which is completely different for other people in other age groups. For example, 2 years for the 15-year-old seems like a lot more time than 2 years for a 50-year-old, for example. It's usually when you take the big differences also in maybe maturity, like a 15-year-old person, when they will look at something as someone that's 17 or 18, they'll say, oh, that person's so mature, so big, so he's such an adult, right? And then when you're 50, you meet someone that's 53, that perception of time is nowhere near the same as when you're 15, 18, 21, or up to 25, even 30, we can make the case. So that's also something very interesting that we haven't actually spoken about, that, okay, it's only a year, it's only 2, but when you're 15 or when you're 20 or 25, that feels like a lot more time than it actually is. So the perception of time cannot be understated enough, let's say, or can't be said enough, because it's something that people haven't really understood in that regard. I mean, I do understand young people haven't been the main demographic that have been mostly affected by COVID in terms of health, right? But we are the generation that has been mostly affected in terms of liberties, what you said right now, in non-formal education, in developing soft skills, in traveling EU. People, for example, that could have the chance to have traveled at the age of 18, done an interrail after the secondary school, did not have this chance. And that's a whole year, or the whole generation of people that did not have that chance to do, let's say, that intercultural dialogue within the European Union. So that is something indeed very, very interesting. I want to say a bit more about you. I want to know a bit more about you, and a bit about your COVID story generally. Because you traveled a bit, right? Tell us a bit more. Why did you decide to do that? How come you traveled a bit? Just give a bit more insight on your COVID story. How did you live COVID when it arrived, when it rose, let's say last year?
Well, for me, COVID started at a very interesting point. I was lucky to travel around in Bangladesh. I left Europe right before the crisis broke loose, but when I arrived in Bangladesh, a lot of people already saw on the news that Europe was like the new hotspot of Corona. And they were always like, ooh, you're the white guy coming here, are you from Belgium or from Italy? Because back then they were the most infected countries. So that was, I was first confronted with the fact like, okay, we have a big crisis, this can be a big thing, because back then we didn't know what this year would bring to us. And then, of course, after that, you're spending 5-6 months obligatory at home. And then, luckily, borders reopened a slightly bit. And for me, as a person who is really identified by this European identity, I really wanted to go back to my country. And my country is Europe. So for me, it doesn't stop at the border. So I decided to first get a trip to a place where I always belonged to since I was young. This was the south of France. And there I saw this completely different mentality. Of course, COVID was taken seriously, but in a sense, the structure in society was maintained. There was still this interaction with people, even with measurements. But then I saw these differences in cultures in Europe, where we here, certainly in Belgium, decided to completely cut all sociological ties, which I guess, to my opinion, also made it harder for us to stick to the general rules of COVID, the general rules of protecting ourselves, because we had to cut off ourselves from everything, which, to my opinion, was a very wrong starting point. Then I started to travel to Italy, and it was even Italians are more sociable with each other. And then I saw they were even more strictly taking care of the basic rules of this crisis. but there was still this interaction that kept people happy, and I had the sense that they took care of their mental health, which we don't do here in Western Europe. And this is, of course, not a thing that started with Corona. It's a long-term story of Western European people, of Belgian people who are not allowed to talk about their mental health. You see it in our figures of suicide, of mental health in young people, of pressure that is put on young people. So there you saw this healthy mindset in Southern Europe that we should take over. And even when I traveled at the end of November to the Balkans, when the situation was getting increasingly hard corona-wise, you saw that the discipline even there was bigger, even though people were smiling more. And that was something that surprised me a lot. The fact that people still dare to say good morning to each other. Here, everyone was looking to his shoes, and they were afraid to talking to each other. And that's, I guess, where our general identity, who is not that open that much here in Western Europe, we're always a bit closed off from each other. But I guess this killed a lot of the non-necessary effects of Corona. The fact that we already closed off and we only look to our shoes. And even in my own street, my neighbor who was in a risk group, he didn't even dare to say good morning to me anymore. Can you imagine? Even not from a distance, because this fear. And also, let's be honest, our media didn't play a very good role in only showing one side of the story, which is necessary, don't get me wrong, we're in a crisis. But on the other hand, there is more in life. There is still a world that is turning. And I guess this is what I really, really lacked in my media here in Flanders and Belgium, that there was no other story than Corona, which obviously only was fear-mongering for the people. And see what we are now. And what I'm very afraid of is, how are we going to rebuild our social network? Because at this point, okay, you have this first phase of your crisis, fine. Nobody knows what is going on. The measurements that have been taken before summer had to be taken. Nobody knew how serious it was. But now, if you see that we're still in the same measurements, there's still the same kind of killing this social aspect of life, certainly for young people, then I guess we're on the wrong track.
I think it's interesting when you spoke about the social ties, because right now we can see there's a general hysteria, and rightfully so, right? We do know the consequences of COVID. We do know what kind of health issues it can cause, especially people at risk, or older people, or people with already other pathologies in a way. But we didn't really do the counterbalance of what these measures will do to young people themselves, or not even to young people, really every single demographic in a way. You spoke a lot about, for example, students that are living in a city they've never been. We know interns that have arrived to a new city and haven't even been able to leave their room, haven't even been able to meet their new co-workers, haven't been able to live the city in which they moved to. And I think this is, maybe correct me if I'm wrong a bit, but I think you would agree in a sense, we are losing a bit the European identity of interculturality, of communicating with each other. When you spoke before about the cultural differences between what could be considered the Southern European countries or the Eastern European countries or Central European countries in comparison to the Western European countries, I think that really is the richness of the EU, that even before COVID itself, there were some cultural differences, but what could counterbalance that cultural difference was the exchange of that difference itself, right? The big united in diversity that we like to say in the EU so much. And that was the big, let's say, landmark, or what could the EU be applauded for, was it interculturality, and having so many different cultures, religions, identities, nationalities getting together, getting to know each other. And I think that's why that has affected young people so much, that this has been completely stripped off in like essentially a week. Because it was funny, because before March it was stop the fear mongering, COVID is not so much. Then at March it was the worst thing ever, and then it's basically becoming what kind of political agenda fits them most, to what kind of measures should we implement. So to get to a question a bit related to that, a bit more on EU scale, not necessarily national scale, do you think, or how do you think that these measures have infringed on one of the fundamental values or fundamental rights, one of the main pillars of the EU, which is freedom of movement. How do you think that has really affected that?
Well, I guess putting a strain on this freedom of movement was just an easy measure for a lot of politicians to hide the lack of decisions that they had to make. And of course, we had for a very long time this right-wing nationalist parties who always wanted to close the borders. So now I guess even for progressive politicians it was like a reason to come halfway and to say, oh look, we are closing the borders, write what you want, now you have no reason to talk about this anymore, we already did it. And because of course these right-wing parties are quite strong and are gaining force in Europe, this was a way for progressive parties who actually should defend Europe to take a political advantage that they shouldn't take on this side. And you see that Europe is of course a lot based on informal agreements. Back in the days, we as founding states, certainly as Belgium, we gave the force to Europe to make a common union, to make a political and economic union. And now you see that with the biggest crisis we ever had, all of a sudden Europe is not worth fighting in for anymore. And for me that's one of the most painful things I saw during this crisis, that closing the borders was just an easy measurement, and a lot of people actually agree with that. Because there is no real pro-European spectrum in politics anymore nowadays. Politicians saw that they could really gain a lot of votes by just showing that they are better in tackling the COVID crisis than their neighbors, instead of showing real statesmanship on the European level, because Europe didn't have a lot of powers on healthcare, on tackling this crisis in general.
It wasn't their competence, basically.
It was their competence.
Yeah, exactly.
Because we never gave, the national member states never gave the competence to Europe. And then it's just a very easy argument to say, oh look, Europe doesn't do anything. Let's close the borders, let's be the national heroes, let's try to be the best of Europe. And Belgium is a good example of that. Right after summer, we were the worst of Europe. We had very bad figures here, and then we didn't take any measurements whatsoever. Everyone was able to enter Belgium without any restrictions. And now all of a sudden we became the best in the figures and we closed everything. Just for the sake of saying, look, we are better than the other country. And in the end, what is the point in Europe nowadays to close this border? For me, I'm living in Bruges, only 15 kilometers from the border with the Netherlands. This means I cannot travel 15 kilometers to the right, but I can travel 300 kilometers to the left, because for the sake there is no border there. And now we are going back to this kind of archaic thinking that we in our own small patch of land can tackle a global crisis, which we always do. Not only with the corona crisis, we always think that we will be better in our own country. And if you see a country like France, a person who is living in the north of France can perfectly go and lay on the beach in the south of France at the Mediterranean. But we, because we live on a 300-kilometer patch of land, all of a sudden we cannot move because of a border. There is no healthcare reason to close the borders. It's only a political decision that has been made for gaining votes. And as long as we, as founding member state, you know what our government literally said? You know, Europe, I'm not going to listen to you right now. Right now, you're not important enough.
Basically, when push comes to shove, they will always choose their own interest before the European common interest.
And Europe is always good for funding. Europe is always good to bring in the big opportunities, to bring in the big trade agreements with all the foreign countries. Then it's all good as long as we can benefit. But whenever there is a crisis, and we really need to show statesmanship on the European level, definitely to defend our European youth, because we are the first generation that can benefit from a really open Europe as one country. Now we are closing this off and we're coming back to our national borders, and this hurts me a lot.
But it is funny in a way, because the the whole idea of Europe was indeed to fight crises when they arrived, right? It was all, that was the point, to fight a crisis together, so we do not relive the same things that happened pre-World War II and the things before that. And I'm under the impression that we're getting into a project where we're really either going either two ways, into more unified Europe or a more divided Europe. We saw recently now with Brexit, of course, what happened there. So I do think it's very interesting how COVID has put things into perspective. And we realize one thing, that generally, again, when push comes to shove, people will always get their own interests at heart, and they will have the national interest on top of that. And when it comes to national and international competence, the EU doesn't really have that much power to do much in terms of healthcare, right? We do have the programs for like Erasmus Plus, Horizon 2020, Discover EU, lots of different things that EU is doing right now that does help young people. But at the end of the day, they don't really have that much decision-making power for especially regarding COVID. How do you see this? How would you say that the EU will need to change in a way, or maybe COVID, taking it as an example, what happened here? How do you foresee the future right now, either for better or for worse?
Well, of course, Europe always had a communication problem in the things that they could do right. What we see in our national media is mostly Europe doing details, because the general big changes in our lives are not flowing through to the local level. That's a bit the problem with Europe. Of course, you have the national politicians, apparently, who do now not want to give power to Europe anymore, who say like, you're a power there, but we still take our own national power first. This is a mentality that needs to be changed. That's one aspect. First and for all, we need to focus on creating a European identity. And of course, this might be like a fluffy way of saying this.
It's too vague, yeah. I mean, I'm going to play devil's advocate. What is a European identity?
But this is all my first point. For now, for me, this is a very personal story. I am not allowed to feel European. This is wrong for a lot of people right now. I cannot be European. You should be a local Belgian guy, preferably a Flemish guy. And a lot of young people who have this European mentality, this European identity, who feel really European, they're not allowed to, because of this historic, and now this crisis, this corona crisis, only made this worse. How can we solve this? As only, once again, European statesmanship. The Treaty of Lisbon needs to have a follow-up. Now, as I told you, the European institutions initiated the Conference on the Future of Europe. This is a very first step to make the necessary steps for a really legislative, economic and political new agreement that needs to be made, so that we never ever come on the same point that whenever there is a big crisis, either it's a health crisis, an economic crisis, a political crisis, that all of a sudden everyone is turning back to themselves and not showing any European statesmanship, for a very simple reason that it doesn't bring any votes right now, because the media is not ready to broadcast what is happening in Europe. So now this conference on the future of Europe is really the key changing point of making this new way of communication towards the European citizens. But of course, there needs to be a stick. Europe needs to have a stick to hit countries whenever they want to say, like Belgium did, oh, we don't care for you right now, we don't care about Europe. It will be very hard negotiations. I don't know if you see with countries like Hungary, like Poland, if this is still possible. But then, to my opinion, you need to change the way on which you vote in Europe, because otherwise you can always put yourself behind the fact, oh, it's because of the voting system that we cannot do anything. Well, some political parties already proposed that there need to be another way of voting, that you can leave out some countries in Europe. Of course, this is very controversial, I understand. But if we want to keep Europe alive, we need to have a follow-up on the Treaty of Lisbon. And the only way to reach this is changing the system, because we need it urgently. Otherwise, we could be the last generation that could have benefited from Europe. And this might be a very pessimist point, I know, but if you see how far we are drifting away from each other, and then there are some people who are proposing a Europe of different speeds, I don't think this is the good way either. If you really make sure that your European cohesion policy works well and is tackling all the issues that need to be tackled, this means, like, of course, you need to have an ecological transition, but just make sure, this is just an example, just make sure that, for example, your ecological transition is feasible in every country. If you go, for example, to the Balkan and you see that those people don't even have decent housing, decent schools, of course you cannot come, oh, do you want to build new windmills, or do you want to place new solar panels? This is an important aspect, but just make sure you have your priorities straight in Europe.
That's very interesting when you come to priorities, especially because, again, Europe is so different within where we can speak European Union, we can speak Europe as a continental Europe, geographical Europe. Everything's very different, and each country has their own priorities. And we saw that now during COVID again, that each country was pushing firstly their own agenda, and then nobody was working together. Well, again, that wasn't the idea of the European Union. If I'm going to ask you now, let's get back on track a bit on the COVID situation. I'm going to follow up with a question which is interlinked. When we speak about COVID, I think everyone knows here, and we all agree, that there has been an awful, let's say, health issue for especially older people with problems, well, previously before that, diabetes maybe, or asthma, or respiratory problems. That said, that has worsened, let's say, other problems of other young people that did initially have those issues. They said now mental health, it was a big issue that has basically come up now even more during COVID. Not that it wasn't there before, but it's maybe tripled or quadrupled in very short span of time. And I think that's probably something that every single country has had in common in a way, especially those that have suffered the most or the strongest lockdowns. Generally, I think it's more Western or Southern countries. I mean, Italy had a strong one, Spain had a strong one, Belgium had a strong, but not as strong as Spain. Belgium's lockdown wasn't as strong as Spain and Italy. What do you think now? So getting into the unification of Europe, what do you think that a young person from, let's say, Portugal has in common with a young person from Estonia or Lithuania? What do you think is the thing that can really unify them?
Well, for now, on a short basis of time, we all brought a very big offer from our lives. I guess that's what brings youth even more together now in Europe, that a lot of young people, the majority actually, really took their responsibility in this crisis and put away their personal lives for the sake of the general benefit, for the sake of the health of everyone. And I guess that's a very crucial point that is under-evaluated in society in general, the big offers that the youth has brought. And I guess out of these offers, we can make this new kind of unity among European youth. Because we all have the same issues in our countries, we all face the same effects of the COVID crisis. We lose a lot of opportunities. There is a lot of unemployment. There is a lot of the gap between generations only widened because of fear, because of this crisis. And I guess it's only the youth who can close that gap again. I don't think the other generations can help with that. So if we showed this much of resilience during this crisis, if we showed how many offers we can bring, we can also bring the same offers to make Europe more unified and to fight for these common problems we all have. Because certainly our jobs will be more than ever interconnected across Europe. Certainly with our new skills, with our new communication skills, or the things that we've learned through all these soft skill experiences, we are ready for this new pan-European life and jobs that we we have to do and have to live. Because where will you find a job that is not interconnected with anything else in Europe? And now you still see an old generation that is not yet ready to cross that border. And you even see it in cities. Cities are doing the transnational municipal networks. We are all part of our communities, and those new generation of political leaders start to work in a more metropolitan way, and it doesn't matter if there is a border in between or not. And specifically for the youth, it will be our common goal to make sure that we ensure that the upcoming generations will have the same opportunities as we have. But we need to communicate once again better, because we are still the privileged people who could do these European projects. Because let's be honest, you really need to have a good background before you can do these projects. It will be the biggest common task that we have to make sure that everyone can benefit from Europe as much as we did, through communicating, through making the European projects visible in our local communities. And it's us who will shape these new cities. It's us who will create these cities into smart cities, which is actually the biggest link we can have with the future, because Europe will always be a big institutional, supranational part who will only become stronger, and in a sense also maybe as a level quite unreachable for many of us. But this doesn't mean that Europe needs to be elitary. It needs to go down to the cities where we as young people create these smart, interlinked municipal, futuristic projects where all of us can find ourselves in. And for me, it is really a dream that the next generation can come into another city and another country and feel perfectly at home with the cultural differences, because this is something we still need to defend. We all have our cultural differences. We have our food, we have our amazing theater plays, our amazing music, our amazing...
Don't you think that's contradictory? Don't you think it's contradictory to say, to have a borderless EU and at the same time preserve those cultures? How do you balance those two?
I'm a very big fan of a Europe of regions, not a Europe of nations.
Mm-hmm.
We will always have our cultural identities, and we need to protect them, because otherwise there is also no Europe. Europe was based on a difference of culture.
We're not the United States. It's a completely different
Exactly.
upbringing. It was a series of nations coming together for a common project. It wasn't bottom up, let's say. It was already up, and then they got together at the top. Yeah.
It's also what makes these kind of exchange programs interesting. What would be the point of an exchange program if everything is the same in all cities and all countries? But we just need to make sure that everyone has the same opportunities and the same kind of developments in their cities all around Europe. And I guess also for youth, we need to make sure that we create a sort of cultural network as well, where we preserve these cultural identities, but we make sure that the technological and the economic benefits are more spread through cohesion policy, mainly across Europe. And I guess this is our biggest task.
I think it's interesting how you brought before the unification of young people, let's say, at a grassroots level. Specifically when you spoke about information, let's say, and how information should be spread, or how action should be taken from young people, that they should be the pioneers into bringing the European values and the European perspective into the future generations. Because we have to be the ones to show then our kids later on, or our grandkids, what were the actual values. It's generation through generation, and we are now that bridge between the generation that came before us and the generation that's going to come after us. Regarding that, what would be your approach then? If you say tomorrow you have a child, what would be your approach to explain to them what is European Union in your eyes, or what is maybe Belgium, because you're Belgian, of course. So how would you explain to them, him or her, what is these two concepts, or these two nations, if you will?
Well, I guess, of course, everything starts with education about Europe in general. I guess this is what we lack in a lot of our education systems, that there is no basic understanding of Europe. Of course, there is a big difference in your economic situation. Of course, for us, it will be more easy to show to our kids what Europe is really about. We are able to show them around Europe. We are able to show these differences in culture, and also showing them that, look, we are not that different after all. Of course, I understand not everyone has these opportunities to show to their kids in a physical way what Europe is about. But I guess when you really have a look what Europe is doing for society, I guess as a parent, you can really show your kids a lot of visible projects and a lot of visible educational benefits that Europe can bring. And it's just a matter of mindset. As long as you know that no matter your culture, we all have the same problems, we all have the same issues, and we just need to make sure that we educate our kids to find this common ground, to find these new ways of making agreements with each other, then I guess as a parent you're on the right track, and you don't need a lot of money for that. You just need to look around in society. Certainly in Belgium, let's be honest, we are the center of Europe. We have enough opportunities to show our kids what Europe is about. And don't get me wrong, Europe is far from perfect. But then we come back to the point, it's about taking political leadership and change something about the agreements.
How can we improve it? There's always room to improve. There's always room to improve. I agree. Do you have something else to add to that, or general?
A personal point from my perspective is for me, if I would have a child, I would focus on a federal Europe, and I would explain my kid what federalism is really about. And this doesn't mean that you cannot feel Belgian anymore. That doesn't feel that you cannot feel citizens of your city anymore. You just need to you can have different kind of identities, and that's perfectly fine, as long as you know that in the end the big European identity is still the level on which we have to solve the problems. If you want it or not, this will be the level to solve our issues, because in a globalized world we will not save ourselves anymore on a regional or on a national level. And that's, I guess, the biggest lesson you need to give to your child.
I guess there's food for thought there, of course, and a lot of room for debate and dialogue to see a bit what does this common EU or common Europe, let's say, in the future looks like. But now we're slowly getting to the end. I do have two last questions. Let's try and be not so brief. I mean, we still have a few minutes left. The first one was a bit, what point, were you trying to make a point a bit, because you were a bit political about you traveling throughout COVID? What point were you trying to make at that moment throughout your travels?
That it is perfectly okay to have a life that is not defined by borders. We still have this mentality that you need to be specifically successful in your job. You need to have your house, your salary, and your local life, and then you can be successful, and you don't need to reach for the stars. And I don't say that you need to dream that big. Of course, you always need to be a realist. But in the end, Europe has so much to bring, and it's so many opportunities are underdeveloped. So many opportunities are not known by the people. So for me, what I wanted to show by traveling is, this is my country. I'm a Belgian, but I'm not longer defined by it. My contacts, my friends, the people I love, all over Europe, even all over the world. But I understand you cannot create a globalized world and a globalized world all of a sudden. But we have this opportunity in a small, interconnected Europe with incredible mobility systems, with cheap flights, with buses, with trains that go everywhere. We invested in that, and we did great as Europe. And all of a sudden, during this crisis, we are throwing all of this away, all of these benefits that people from other continents can only dream about. And for me, it was just showing like, look what we have, look what a beautiful future we can bring to our children if we just don't come back to these borders. And for me, I always get even emotional about it, because you cannot even imagine how much it hurts me right now that they're just closing the borders out of nowhere, and that they say, oh, that person in France is all of a sudden worse than us. Can you imagine that even in Belgium, maybe they should have closed the language border? Because what's the difference between a national border and a language border? It was just archaically created back in the days for the sake that there was no Europe yet. But now that there is a Europe, there is no point anymore. And let me link this to COVID. Please, let's use our national borders to do health checks to people. That's an important aspect of the borders. You can do perfectly health checks at your border, make sure that people don't have corona. That's a very good, useful thing of your borders, but don't use them to block people's mobility.
That was actually the point I wanted to make, so we don't get any misinterpretations by what we are saying. The point is that we don't really see the difference between moving, let's say, from Bruges to Brussels, as you are also going borders, and moving from Bruges to Maastricht, for example, or from Bruges to Amsterdam or to Paris, because in the end it's that same travel, and you can still move around and let's say make the most of your European privilege to travel within these borders and within these nations, and at the same time keep those sanitary measures to stop the spread of COVID in general. And I do think there was an option to have a nice balance between both things, right? People say we can't have it all. True, we can't have absolutely everything at 100%, but we can have some 50-50. We can have a bit of everything if we do it correctly, and we get into the right dialogue, and we have the right conversations with the actual relevant information. And we shouldn't forget the generation that is getting affected right now, I think, and that is generally young people. Now, we're getting at the end, and I have this one last question, plus maybe your final statement. After all of this, after this conversation, now during COVID and maybe even after COVID later on, what would you continue fighting for? What is your drive in life?
Political sanity. The thing is that that politics got completely lost in this corona crisis, and both in European politics, also in identity politics, of course, and also the fact that there is no pro-European political spectrum anymore. It all became a bit Eurosceptical, and also with the measures that they've taken, it's not logical. As you said, you can perfectly follow up the rules in every European country. They just need to, there's the basic rules. It doesn't matter if there is a border or not. And because of a lot of stupid measurements that have been taken, for example, you cannot see for friends, but you can be in a train full of people, and that's all of a sudden not that dangerous anymore. I guess the politics are now in the biggest crisis there ever been, the biggest crisis of credibility they have ever been. And for me, it will always be my fight to make sure to find a nuanced ground in politics, because politics became incredibly difficult in the past few years with the social media. And for me, it's a matter of storytelling. I guess when you are showing people with images, with very speaking visual things, what is going on in Europe, I guess you can change this narrative, and you can make sure that the political dialogue becomes way more diversified, and the fact that we don't lose ourselves anymore in identity politics, that we don't lose ourselves anymore in the day-to-day struggle, but that we really start thinking again about long-term common projects that all bind ourselves and that all belong to building a better future for our next generation. Because, you know, after the Second World War, this was the first thing that people thought about. Let's build a better society for our kids. And I guess this is something that we lost because we are looking to our shoes. And that's for me my ever long-lasting political drive, to make sure that by telling stories that we have seen, by telling the cultural difference that we have, and by finding the common grounds and telling European youth that definitely, if they want, they can make this change. And if they really, really know these cultural differences, they will be able to win the political battle. Because in the end, if you want it or not, it will be always a political battle, because they have the power to change things. And maybe soon we will have.
Indeed, it's a bit like the idea, leave the world better than you found it. Always try to make it better, try to improve it. And I think the key point to make is dialogue. We don't need to agree on everything, but we need to agree how to play the game, how to discuss with each other, how to improve what is Europe, maybe how to improve the regions, how to improve the countries, how to have a common project so we can all actually progress in one common way for the common good of everyone. I think we're going to leave it there. Do you have any other things you would like to add?
Not specifically, I guess this was quite an interesting topic, and I actually just wanted to thank you for the fact that you also, as a young person, you wanted to tackle this issue, because it got... I guess nowadays we are not actually allowed to talk about this common project that binds us. We are so focused on the issues that we have now, today.
We are so focused on what divides us that we don't actually concentrate ourselves on what actually unifies us, which I think we should think more about the positive things and the negative for a healthy mindset.
And of course we are in a very big crisis, don't get me wrong, I'm not underestimating anything. But there is a life after that. And I just want to thank you for the fact that you're looking beyond this. Let's start, build our future.
I mean, of course, thank you very much, but I actually want to thank you too to be here and to tell us your story, tell us your perspective also. So I think it is important to give the voice to people that really do want to express it and do have a point to make on one specific thing. And that's why the word dialogue really is the key for a more unified Europe, in a sense, or a Europe free of borders, or with freedom of movement, let's say. I wouldn't say free of borders, because that's of course a much larger a discussion in itself, but freedom of movement was one of the founding pillars of the European Union, and that should be something that should be, let's say, untouchable. It's something that we shouldn't even dare to question, even with such an extraordinary situation that we are living today. Anyway, we're going to leave it there. Thank you very much again, Maxime van der Kerkhove, for joining us. And again, I'm Ismail Civico, and this was Youth on Air. See you next time.